3 states are voting tonight. Democrats are holding caucuses in Idaho and Utah and primaries in Arizona. Republicans are caucusing in Utah and have a primary in Arizona. But this is all against the backdrop of today's attacks in Brussels. Let's bring in our political panel. Steve Chaggaris is our CBS News senior political editor. Hogan Gidley is a Republican strategist and former senior advisor for the Mike Huckabee campaign. And Lynda Tran is a CBSN political contributor and founding partner with 270 Strategies. Before we start, we should disclose that several employees at 270 Strategies do some work for the Hillary Clinton campaign. However, Lynda herself does not. All right, Steve, so let's start with you. I want to point to this notion that this is the third major attack now that we have seen since full campaigning really started. How do we expect this attack to affect the campaign?
Well, what we see generally is that terrorism, foreign policy, Republicans rate those issues higher than Democrats do generally. But then after these attacks, you see it sort of boost on both sides. So, for instance, after San Bernardino in December, terrorism became the top issue for Republican voters. And on the Democratic side, foreign policy and terrorism became the number 2 and 3 issues. Before that, they were way down at 4 and 5, behind like climate change and health care. So these kinds of attacks, whether they're here in this country or overseas, tend to get voters thinking about these issues again. I also want to point out, too, it's interesting that after San Bernardino, immigration got a boost among Republicans as well. So those are the kinds of issues that that actually get a spike after these kinds of events.
Yeah, a lot of people very interested in that. Hogan, I want to play a clip from Donald Trump's speech after last week's primaries in Florida, Ohio, and Missouri, and then we'll talk about it.
So we started, and something happened called Paris. Paris happened, and Paris was a disaster. There've been many disasters, but it was Paris. And then we had a case in Los Angeles where it was in California where the 14 young people were killed, and it just goes on and on and on. And what happened with me is this whole run took on a whole new meaning. The meaning was very simple. We need protection in our country, and that's going to happen. And all of a sudden, the poll numbers shot up, and I'm just very proud to be a part of this.
All right, so let's go ahead and look at some of these poll numbers, Hogan, because we have one here, confidence in Trump's ability to handle international crisis among Republican primary voters. You have 29% saying they feel very confident. You have 29% saying somewhat confident, 40% not too confident, not at all confident. Then you look at Ted Cruz, if we can pull that one up. This is among Republican primary voters. You see that 24% say they're very confident, 34% not too, 38% somewhat confident, 34% not too confident, not at all confident. But what do you make of Donald Trump's kind of notion there that he gets a boost? Does he, when there's news like this?
He does, and let's be honest, the reason he even shot up in the first place was he was all about immigration at the beginning. This is what he talked about whenever he was questioned about foreign policy or terrorism or the border fence or whatever he wanted to discuss, whatever the question was, he would always go back to, we wouldn't even be having this conversation had I not been in the race and talking about immigration from the get-go. So he has kind of owned this issue from the start. And in a time of confusion, in a time of terrorism like we're in right now, and this is kind of the new normal, and a lot of experts say this is just going to continue, you look for someone who has clarity on the issue. Now, you may disagree with Donald Trump. You may say, how is he going to do it? Voters don't care. What they want to know is, what are you going to do? And he says, I'm closing down the borders. I'm going to get rid of ISIS. Those are 2 simple talking points. You don't need to nuance it. You don't need to go into a long foreign policy discussion and what would that do to the Geneva Convention and should we waterboard? You close the borders, you crush ISIS, and people love it.
People can understand.
People understand it, absolutely.
Yeah. All right, Lynda, let me turn to you. Let's talk about the Democrats. In a national poll from February, 45% of Democrats said the economy and jobs was the most important issue to them. 13% said health care was. Just 5% said terrorism was the most important issue. Does an event like this impact the Democrats the way that it does on the Republican side?
Well, so far it really hasn't. And I think that part of the reason why Democrats are focused on some of these other issues as opposed to terrorism is it hasn't really been a really big issue on the Democratic campaign trail. Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton are talking about income inequality. They're talking about climate change, and they are talking about health care. They are not talking about building fences or banning Muslims from this country. When that's a focus on the Republican side, it makes sense that the Republican primary electorate is much more focused on that.
All right, Steve, let me ask you, did you want to say something?
Well, I was going to say, it's also worth pointing out that you don't hear Sanders ever talking about foreign policy or terrorism, and it's not hurt him at all, really. I mean, he's still doing fairly well in the polls, and he doesn't need to. It's among Democrats, these aren't issues. Even after events like this, it goes up a bit, but it's never at the forefront of what Democrats are talking about.
And Republicans' main point in all the debates are the #1 function of the federal government is to keep us safe. So if that's if we feel as though that's the #1 function of the federal government, because states can't do it, the federal government has to do it, and we're for small government. We don't want the federal government involved in education and health care and climate change and all these things. We want them defending our borders and protecting us. It would make total sense that it's much higher rated in Republican circles than Democrats.
All right, I want to ask you about something Senator Ted Cruz said today about patrolling Muslim neighborhoods to try to secure them, essentially, before he said they're radicalized. Where do you think that's coming from? Let's go ahead and play it. I'm told we actually have a soundbite.
Listen, Muslim Americans, like all Americans, are bearing the consequences of jihadists waging war against them. Muslims as well are killed by radical Islamic terrorists in the Middle East and elsewhere. And if you look here in the city of New York had a proactive policing program that Mayor Michael Bloomberg championed to work cooperatively with the Muslim community to prevent radicalization, to stop radical Islamic terrorists from carrying out terror attacks before they occur. And Mayor Bill de Blasio, when he came in a peak of political correctness, canceled the program. That is refusing to acknowledge the threat that we have, and the world is too dangerous to deny reality.
All right, so Steve, where's that coming from?
Well, I mean, Trump has had success talking tough about Muslims, right? And he, even though he announced this Muslim ban idea a while back, that never really hurt him. In fact, his numbers continue to get stronger. Then you look at the exit polls out of almost every one of these primaries and caucuses, and you ask Republican voters what do they think of the Muslim ban, they all overwhelmingly supported it. Yeah. So I suspect Cruz is seeing this and saying, and I suspect he's seeing these numbers and sort of forming an argument based on what Republican voters are saying, which is they want to hear this kind of tough talk.
Yeah. No, so what about Hillary Clinton? I mean, you know, you don't hear her talking about this. You don't hear her necessarily. She's speaking out against a lot of these notions. However, you see on the Republican side, as Steve was pointing out, there is support there for the idea behind some of these things, like the temporary ban on Muslims entering the U.S. Where does she fall into this discussion, if you're looking ahead, for instance, to the general?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like Hogan said, there are some very simple, comforting talking points here, but we all know that's not Hillary Clinton's MO. She responded to this in a very nuanced, policy-specific way, talking about how we need to increase staffing around soft targets, and actually in a lot of ways showcasing some of the experience that she had when she was Secretary of State. But
isn't that a liability, though? Because, you know, the Republicans might say, well, ISIS grew under her watch.
Well, I don't think that anybody is going to saddle Hillary Clinton with the problem that has become ISIS and the threat that's occurred against this country long since before ISIS even existed. It's obviously very complicated how tensions arose in that region. But that said, anytime there is a conversation about a foreign policy issue and about our standing in the world, I actually think that she has an opportunity there to burnish some of the better credentials that she has.
First of all, Republicans absolutely will try to hold that over her head, and whether it's effective or not is another issue, but they will do that for sure. Second is, let's go to an authenticity point here with Ted Cruz and Donald Trump. Immigration was not a highly rated topic or issue for Republicans, and he was on that from day one, right? These people aren't flying blind. Hillary Clinton polls every day. Ted Cruz polls every day. They know what the hot button issues are for their electorates. Ted Cruz sees himself losing ground to this, to Donald Trump, so he's going to try and out-Trump Trump. The problem is you can't do that on this issue. And one of the thing in politics we all know, it's so simple. You want to define yourself before your opponent defines you. You want to define your opponent before they can define themselves. Donald Trump has already defined himself on this issue. It's going to be very difficult for Ted Cruz to move anywhere to the right of Donald Trump on a national security issue.
Could that backfire? Could he actually lose, you think, support by tacking this far right? Or Ted Cruz by trying to, no.
I don't believe so in the electorate the way it is today, especially on the Republican side. What he could lose on is pandering. If poll numbers, he hadn't said this until now, Donald Trump has been saying what he's saying today for the last, 9 months. So Ted Cruz doing it now is a little bit disingenuous.
All right. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out, just back to what Hillary Clinton is doing. She's definitely playing the general election card here and talking about her experience, talking about how she has the best plan to deal with the only detailed plan. And she talks about steady hands. You need a steady hand, right? And I think that's a direct dig at somebody like Trump and his temperament. And so she's playing the general election game. Cruz and Trump are still playing the primary game, trying to woo Republican primary voters because Cruz needs every voter he can get.
He's playing the general election game, too. I don't know if that's going to play well in the general election. But look, you go back to something like waterboarding, right? 50% of Americans like it. 33% don't, 20% aren't sure. So if 50% of the people are already on your side, if that 20% who's undecided actually decide that waterboarding is nasty, it's still a 50-50% split. So I'm saying Trump is moving that direction. Whether it's a good political play for the general election or not, I don't see him deviating on this at all.
Well, it's funny because they're actually both saying the same thing about him, which is he's saying being unpredictable is a good thing, and that's what we need to do. That needs to be a core part of our foreign policy. It's actually one of the things that the Washington Post editorial board really dinged him on after his interview with them yesterday. And she's saying he's totally unpredictable, and that's a bad thing. But they're describing him in the same way, which is fascinating to me.
All right. We have so much to talk about. We have to leave it there for now. But Steve Chaggaris, Hogan Gidley, and Lynda Tran, thank you so much. Appreciate it.